So biochemical. Um, Let me tell you my experience with this type of thing. It's primarily in mental health. When I became a mental health investigator, I did not believe. I don't want to say I didn't believe in medication. I was always of the opinion that it was a behavioral issue, and that these people just I don't know. I don't want to say that I didn't think they needed medication, but I didn't understand the effects of medication on them. And then I began to work as an investigator for the Department of Mental Health, and I would see these people come in just completely off the wall, unable to speak, unable to communicate, or communicating in different languages. That not because they could speak a foreign language, but because they made up their own language, and just completely insane is the best word to describe it. Absolutely insane. And then I would see the progress every single week of medication on their lives. It wasn't like they just decided to be different. You could see medication affecting their lives on a day-to-day basis, and so that's an interesting contrast to see, and interesting to see how it affected them. And you have this person who would literally be talking a make-believe language to a lamp, or believe that they were Jesus Christ and have people following them. Um, and within 30 days would have a very normal, very intelligent, very um, interesting conversation with you. And so the biochemical crowd, I don't think they're completely off. I think that there's definitely some tendencies, criminal tendencies, that can be altered with the use of chemicals. So I think we have to remember that. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you about the psychological theory, of course, and that is where uh, good old Sigmund Freud gets to show his face in every textbook. Uh, you know, um, Having a degree in psychology, obviously I hear about Sigmund Freud all the time. Um, pioneer, absolutely pioneer in his day for psychology, but he also pioneered some crazy, crazy philosophies. So, um, and within his, he talks about the super ego and the id and that kind of stuff, and there's also some psychological foundations and why people commit crimes. But then we go into a social learning theory, and that's an interesting one because what that's saying is that people learn their behavior, and that behavior is learned, and that it is something that I guess criminal behavior is learned. So that brings some questions up. Here's my first question: if that is accurate, then why would you have someone who's raised in a criminal family become a reputable pastor, or someone who's raised in a criminal family pull themselves out of that and not be a criminal? If this behavior is learned, then they should have learned it, and they should become what they have learned. Um, so don't get me wrong. I think that it plays a role in it, especially when we look in the gang culture. El Salvador is an excellent example. In the 80s, El Salvador had a civil war, and I mean, many of the men were lost as a result of this civil war. And at that point in time, the gangs really took an opportunity, in specific two gangs called the MS and the 18th Street Gang, um, took that opportunity to, I don't know, to over, to almost take over the youth population. And they created a culture where youth would look up to them and want to be part of that gang because they felt like they had nothing else because they were fatherless children. Um, so did those boys? If MS and 18th Street hadn't come into El Salvador, would those boys still be committing criminal acts? I don't think so. So social learning definitely plays a role. maybe not the only role, but it plays a role. And maybe all these play a role, and it's a little bit of combination of this, and a little bit of combination of that, a little bit of everything that we have to think about. The last thing in chapter 2 I want to talk to you about is labeling theory. And this is something that you hear a lot, especially in the juvenile detention world. If you're working with juvenile offenders, you'll hear in the adult system, but more so in the juvenile offender world. And when I worked for a juvenile correction center, we were not allowed to call juvenile. We weren't allowed to call them inmates because we didn't want to label them with that. We had to call them. We called them youths. Youth Smith. Instead of saying inmate Smith, we say youth Smith. Did this, this, and this. So, can we label somebody? I think we can. I guess this gets into community corrections that we're going into chapter 3, so I'll talk about this now. I think sometimes we label people that don't need to be labeled. And I'll give you a good example. Does a first-time offender of, let's say, a theft, need to have an ankle bracelet? Now, I'll tell you the conservative nature of myself, who wants to see crime equal punishment, says absolutely, who cares? Put the ankle bracelet on it. But then we have to ask ourselves, what benefit is it to this offender, and what are we causing any? Are we causing more harm than good? If that makes sense. And I just think that's something we have to ask ourselves. I think it's something important to think about. Are we causing more harm by labeling those people? I don't think that I'm not one of those guys that gives away an award for participation. I think we call a winner and a loser not the winner, I guess. But I do think that sometimes we can put on to someone that's a bad kid. With my kids, whenever we discipline them, I never say to my son, "You're a bad boy," because I'm not going to let that get into his head. It's not that you're a bad boy. What you did was wrong. And a lot of times, especially with juvenile offenders, we say, "This is a juvenile delinquent. This is a criminal." And we label that person. We set them aside. It's like a sex offender. I mean, once you're accused of being a sex offender, especially as a teacher or something like that, forevermore you are a sex offender. So that's where labeling theory comes into play, and that's when you're talking about community corrections, which pretty much covers a lot of stuff. Community corrections covers, home confinement, which is an intermediate correctional sanction. It covers, the GPS monitoring. It covers the drug testing. It covers the domestic violence programs. All that stuff, is covered within the community corrections program. So, let's go into community corrections real quick. We'll hop on over to the next video, and that should be your last.